entire network. The first one being understanding policy solutions to address chronic absence. We have a panel today of 3 experts on this issue. So we are so excited to have them join us today. I will introduce them in just a minute. But while we go through the agenda and what we have in store for you today, we invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat, your name, where you're coming from, your organization, what role you have, and maybe even why you're here. Why are you interested in this topic? So we'd love to have you join us, engage with us in the chat. And next slide. So one of our practices here at IEL is we always do a land recognition. So our office is based in Washington, D.C., and we sit on the Piscataway Conoy tribe's land. We encourage you to learn about the Native land in your organization sits on to better learn about the history of the Native people in your community, in both where you live and work. Next slide, please. One of the other practices that we have at IEL is we engage in what we call gracious space. So what does that mean? At IEL, all of our learning opportunities are created so people can grow and learn, and which space is courageous. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to ask hard questions. And it's okay to learn something new and to let go of assumptions that you might have from experiences. So we want you to know that we like for you to step up, to ask questions, to engage, but also step back to give other people a space and a place to learn and ask questions as well. Next slide, please. And also, if you could mute yourself, that would be great too. So like I said, we have our gracious space learning. So that means we have a spirit of being gracious. The space, or the setting, excuse me, allows you to be creative and innovative. We ask you to invite the stranger in considering complexity and innovation, and to learn in public. So that requires humility, a willingness to explore, and let go of the right way of learning or doing things, to be able to be open to new ideas and new things that might challenge previous learned experiences. Next slide. All right, so here's our agenda for the day. We've done our land recognition and guiding principles. We're going to do a community builder in just 1 second, which you'll be able to talk to other people who are at today's webinar. We'll have a panel discussion. You'll have the chance to do a Q&A with our panelists. We'll do a quick group of reflection, and then we want to hear from you. We take your feedback very, very seriously. We use it to inform and shape our webinars moving forward. So we'll drop a link in the chat for evaluation at the end of this webinar, and we hope that you will fill it out. Next slide, please. All right, here is our community builder. So today we're talking about chronic absence. And so I thought something that might be kind of fun is what is the silliest excuse you've ever given or you've ever heard if you're a teacher or an educator for missing school? So for me, I grew up in Texas, and I hated going to, when I was in middle school, we would have to do jogging day every Thursday. And when it's 105 degrees outside, the last thing I want to do is go run around a track. And so I would be sick every Thursday when I was in 7th grade, and that caught up to me very quickly when I was in school. And so that was one of the reasons why I never wanted to go. So we thought we'd have an opportunity just to kind of get to know each other a little bit, be a little silly. So for the next 4 minutes, we're going to break you up into groups. Maddie, if we could break people up into groups of 3 in breakout rooms, we're going to give you 4 minutes to kind of share maybe what's an excuse you've given for missing school, or one of the silliest things you've heard in a classroom. All right, we'll see you all back here at 2:09 Eastern Time. All right, it looks like we have people coming back, so we'll give just 1 more second for people to rejoin. And then when we have more people, we will go ahead and get started with introducing our panel. All right. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We hope that was a fun experience for you all. And with that, I want to go ahead and get started with our panel discussion. So I'd love to introduce our panel today. Our first speaker is Hetty Chang, founder and executive director of Attendance Works, a national and state level initiative aimed at advancing student success by addressing chronic absence. Deeply committed to promoting two-generation solutions to achieving a more and just, equitable society, Hetty has spent more than 3 decades working in the fields of family support, family economic success, education, and child development. She serves as a senior program officer as the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund and is co-director of California Tomorrow, a nonprofit committed to drawing strength from cultural, linguistic, and racial diversity. In February 2013, Hetty was named by the White House as a champion of change for her commitment to furthering African American education. Welcome, Hetty.
Thank you.
We also have Ashley Wallace, Associate Director of Education Programs at the National Conference of State Legislatures. As Associate Director in the Education Program, Ashley Wallace leads the NCSL's work on after-school, summer learning, student mental health, social and emotional learning, and other whole child education policy topics. Before joining NCSL in 2008, Wallace was a legislative director for a member of the U.S. House of Representatives and later worked in federal relations for Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or MAD, and Save the Children. She has degrees in international studies and diplomacy and foreign affairs from Miami University. Ashley, we're happy to have you here today. And we also have Anna Mayer, Senior Policy Advisor and Researcher at the Learning Policy Institute. Anna is a Senior Policy Advisor and Researcher at the Learning Policy Institute and co-leads the whole child education team with a focus on community schools. Her policy work and research focuses on federal, state, and local investments in community schools, with a particular focus on California. Anna began her career managing an after-school program for elementary school students in Oakland and went on to teach 2nd and 3rd grade in the OUSD school district and Aspire Public Schools. Mayer received an MPP from the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, a multiple subjects CLAD teaching credential from the New College of California, and a BA in Psychology and Education Studies from Carleton College. Welcome, Anna. So we're so excited to have our highly credentialed and subject matter experts here to join us with our panel today. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get started with our first question. So my first question is for Hetty. During the 2023-2024 academic year, some school districts experienced absentee rates as high as 30 to 33% on any given day. How does this absentee rate compare to pre-pandemic levels? Has there been any improvement since the height of the pandemic?
Thanks, Michelle. And if we can go to the next slide, just before I answer that question, just because it matters what you're trying to measure, I want to make sure, and I don't want to make assumptions that people know what these things are. You were asking the term about chronic absence, which is missing 10% or more of the school year, counting all absences, excused, unexcused, and suspensions. So we think that's a really important way to count it because we're trying to, one, by doing it 10%, it's an early morning measure. I'm not waiting. So 180-day year school is a typical school year. If it's 18 days, I don't want to just look at 18 days because by the time the kid missed 18 days, it's a little too late to do something about it. You want to be looking at 2 days every month, 4 days in, the second month, 2 days in the first month, 4 days in the second month. We're trying to look at how do you think about the impact of those missed days. And we're trying to take more prevention problem solving approaches that cultivate family engagement, which is really different from truancy, which is how people have typically thought about it. That's just unexcused absences. And actually what defines truancy varies across states and even locally. What's excused, what's not excused, how many days before you get considered truant, all varies across the country. So you actually can't even understand truancy data unless you actually know a lot about what's going on locally. That's different from average daily attendance, which a lot of people focus on because sometimes it's used to fund activities. And so but it's a school level measure, and both average daily attendance and truancy can mask really high levels of chronic absence. So with that definition in mind, if we go to the next slide, when we looked at chronic absence data, looking at national data, so this is the data that the feds produce, we saw that it was about 16% pre-pandemic. That was about 8 million kids. And by 21, 22, where it really peaked for all of us, and that was that first, schools closed in 1920, right? And by the way, spring of 20, a lot of times people stop taking attendance. 2021 data is highly, highly suspect data because we didn't know how to take attendance in virtual learning environments, I would say, in any consistent way. By the time we were back in place, 21, 22, and if you probably brings back memories, that was when we had Omicron, when we had Delta, we had all these things, and it was the first when everyone was back in person. That's where it was height. It was almost 30%. We saw it, state data. We still are waiting for the Fed. Someday they will give us data again. But right now, state data shows that it decreased a couple percentage points. And if you go to the next slide, this is the data that Return to Learn Tracker probably has the most comprehensive current data. They have 14 states, and you can see, I know this is a little bit hard to read, but the greens were the pre-pandemic, the red was the height, 21-2. The yellow is where we are at the end of the 23-24 school year, which is the school year we're just passed. What you can see is chronic absence is going down, good, going in the right direction for most places. I actually think he doesn't, there's a few places where it's not, like if you look at the Mississippi data, it went down and then it didn't quite go down. So it's not continuing always to fall, but in most places it's continuing to fall, which really shows how this is not an immediate decrease. To get us decreasing our chronic absence is going to really require persistence, commitment, attention over time.
Yeah, thank you for that overview of the data. I think it's really helpful to see it over a long-term span and really understand how those numbers are panning out in reality. So you made the point about this is, a longer term problem. What really is the root cause of chronic absence? Like, what do you think is causing this data to pan out the way it is?
Yeah, so if you go to the next slide, I really think these really high levels of chronic absence across the country reflect an erosion in positive conditions of learning that we're still trying to put back in place. Now, I will say, because remember, chronic absence was a problem before the pandemic. There were 8 million kids, and some people really suffered from it. And I actually think in those cases, they might not have had these positive conditions for learning then either. But when we closed down schools and we said, don't come to school because it's not physically healthy for you. We have a disease you might catch. That erodes that first one, that school is a physically, emotionally healthy and safe place. I will also say at the same time, we also see incidents of school violence in ways that hadn't, that was kind of in parallel. I'm not quite sure what the connection between the two is. And then you have more social media than ever before that allows people to know about those incidents of school violence. So, and you hear reports from families about, we're worried about bullying. So if we want kids to show up to school, it's kind of Maslow's hierarchy. They got to feel school's healthy and safe for them to be in. We also know that when we shut down schools, and even when schools reopen, I think it's been hard to create the belonging, connection, support. It's hard to repair relationships, but also people haven't quite gone back to connecting to each other. We're all still a little nervous about COVID, I think. And we also may have gotten out of the habit of connecting with people as much. So that's still a challenge. And then in schools, you have real challenges of possibly staffing challenges. Kids mobile, especially if you're in low income and you're insecure, housing insecure, so you're moving around, so you don't create that sense of belonging, connection, support. Academic challenge and engagement. Do schools feel like a place where I'm gonna get to a better future and I feel engaged? And then making sure schools have adults and students with the well-being and social competence that they can invest in those relationships. When these things are not in place, kids and in large numbers tend to not show up. And if you go to the next slide, I just want to reiterate, and this is related, is that, the only way you improve attendance is when you find out why kids are missing school. What that looks like is going to vary somewhat by locality, but we can also see some things that occur across localities, but I think it's better for people to know what's happening in their own locality and state, and then we aggregate up to say what are the common patterns, because I don't want to ever make assumptions about what is or isn't. So is it barriers? And we do know a lot of low-income communities are still hard hit by the pandemic. Is it aversion? They're anxious, they have peer challenges, they're feeling bullying. Is it disengagement because they're bored, they don't have the enrichment activities? Maybe enrichment activities haven't even come back in the way they were before the pandemic. Or for high school kids, they didn't earn credits during a certain period of time, and now they just don't feel hopeful about graduating because of all the things that happened to them during the pandemic. Or is it misconceptions? And in my small group before, we had a group from Mobile, Alabama, who I had actually been out to Birmingham to meet. So and they were talking about the challenges of coming back from virtual learning, where people think, oh, I can just make up virtually from, when they don't really appreciate all the things that you get in in-person learning and how important that is. Or similarly, this issue of what symptoms, this might even connected to the exercise excuses that kids give. I have a stomach ache. I have a sniffle. I don't know if it's silly, but we got really good during the pandemic to tell everyone, don't show up to school if you see any sign of illness. But now we got to say, no, you know what? That's not the case anymore. Minor symptoms of illness are not a reason to come to school. And let's say it's anxiety related. If you keep staying out, anxiety is going to get worse. It's actually going to exacerbate the problem, not help it. So these are buckets that everyone can use to think about what happens locally. And that can then inform your local strategies. And if they're happening in lots of places, we need system solutions to address them.
Yeah, thank you for that really robust overview and reminding us that, there's some nuance to this. There's some different community factors that might be impacting this. So thank you for that really robust overview.
Can I say one other thing,
Yes, please.
Michelle, which is
Mhm.
regardless of the reason, one of the things I think we want to keep in mind is relationship building.
Mhm.
Because unless you have relationships with kids and families, they don't tell you what the real reasons are that they're not there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that reminder. Anna, my next question is for you. Going back to the data, what does it say about the long-term effects of chronic absence? How can policy advocates effectively use this data when educating families and lawmakers about this issue?
Yeah, well, first I want to give a shout out to the Ed Policy Fellowship Program, because I did that program in California back in 2015. So it's fun seeing all the fellowship folks on the chat. So when we think about some of the effects or impacts of these absenteeism rates that Hetty shared, it's very sobering, because it's obvious that if you have a student who's missing 20 days or maybe even 40 days or more, 60 days, we know for some students, we know it can be a lot more than that 18 to 20 day minimum. They're obviously missing out on a lot of learning opportunities, but they're also not able to engage socially. So they're missing out on the opportunities to really be in class, doing that relationship building that Hetty was naming with their peers, with adults at the school. You cannot build trusting relationships if you are not there. And in the long run, we also see very clear evidence that chronically absent students are more likely to fall behind academically, which again, that makes sense. If you're missing lessons regularly, it's very difficult to sustain that academic process. And in the really long term, we see that chronically absent students are more likely to drop out of school, what's especially concerning is that we see that chronic absence rates are highest in school districts that are serving a lot of students and families from low-income backgrounds and communities. And so this is a serious equity issue, because when we start to think about these long-term impacts and where we see the rates the highest, we see that this is increasing the opportunity gap that we so desperately need to address. So I think it's something that we really need to take very seriously. And I do think that there have been there has been a lot of attention, and I think a lot of people are taking the peak in chronic absenteeism seriously. I know that Attendance Works has been, partnering with other national organizations trying to get some like state actions going, which Hetty, maybe you'll talk about later. And we've seen that there's bipartisan attention to the issue. And so I think if we can really try to center students in this conversation and say, like, what is best for supporting these students and their families. I hope that we can keep this, not about the politics, but around really thinking about how to best serve the needs of students and families. Ashley, I'm sure you'll talk about that as well, how some of the states are approaching this work. But I do think that starting with the data and attending to the data is the most effective thing to do, because you cannot look at those numbers and say that and deny that there's a serious issue that we need to address.
Yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, actually, my next question is for you about states and what are some of the common misconceptions about chronic absence that impact the way that lawmakers might address this issue?
Yeah, so policymakers are very concerned about the issue and they want to address it, but we are seeing a few misconceptions that we've been working hard to educate around. And one of them is that there tends to be some confusion around what truancy is versus chronic absentee, what chronic absenteeism encompasses, which includes, as you heard, absences for any reason. And there's sometimes the misconception that excused absences aren't a problem, that nothing can be done about them, when we know students can be chronically absent by missing an excused day or two every few weeks, and that there are ways to address excused absences. And then the other main misconception that we've been working to dispel is that there isn't a silver bullet solution to chronic absenteeism. One myth out there is that a punitive approach is the silver bullet. But as you heard from Hetty and from Anna, there are numerous factors that influence chronic absenteeism, and the strategies and interventions are varied and include prevention. And so just wanted to talk about a couple of those buckets of strategies. Hetty mentioned engaging students. This is particularly an issue for older students. Engaging instruction could include project-based learning, flexible scheduling so that they can have a job in the afternoon, career pathways, CTE, as well as being able to earn credit, college credit in high school. And then understanding kindergarten and first grade. So why students miss in the early grades is going to be very different oftentimes than why older students are missing school. And as Anna mentioned, gathering actionable data is really key in order to understand attendance patterns, identify trends, and inform decision-making so that there can be targeted interventions. Hetty mentioned enriching opportunities for students after school, summer learning opportunities, multi-tiered system of supports can also provide an overall approach to students, but also a targeted approach to addressing attendance challenges. I know Anna's going to talk a little bit about the policy lever of community partnerships. Encouraging fair attendance practices. This is one that policymakers, I don't think, always think of, but using fair attendance practices that consider the diverse needs of students, as well as diverse circumstances of students. And then finally, as I mentioned before, alternatives to legal action, the prevention side of things, including counseling or mentoring, family engagement initiatives. And I will turn it back over to Michelle.
Actually, Ashley, I have a question for you. Can you talk a little bit more about fair attendance practices? What does that mean?
I kind of what I think of is like not over, it sounds counterintuitive and but not overly strict, like kind of taking it into account all the different needs. And that could be, you know, perhaps a student needs community supports, their family needs extra help, but sometimes when attendance practices are too strict, it's detrimental to attendance. And yeah, I think Hetty could talk a little bit
Could
more.
I
Sure.
offer an example? So one key issue I want to say is that we think unexcused, I think it goes into, Ashley, as you were talking, these myths, and unfortunately, I don't think it's limited to legislators, some of these misconceptions. Like, we think if an absence was unexcused, it means a kid didn't care and they're skipping school. But actually, what gets an absence labeled unexcused is it's just that no one knew what happened, and then it ends up unexcused often, sometimes. It's really arbitrary. The kid didn't come in with a note. Now it's unexcused. Um, and what I would say is in California, we actually found that so I think Anna and I both live here in California, so sorry, the royal we of California, although I do work nationally. But in California, one of the things we had been able to do was to support it. We have state legislation that had mandated for years that if a kid is considered truant, which in California is missing 3 unexcused absences, or is 30 minutes late by class 3 times, you have to deliver, this is in state law, a notice of truancy. The notice of truancy includes language that says, and if your absences don't improve, we're threatening you with taking you to court. It's not exactly a great way to build and forge a partnership. So we did a whole experiment with LA Unified, which showed that actually if you write a nice note, you get better attendance than if you threaten with court action at the first contact with families. And California just passed and adopted legislation that now takes away the negative language, inserts positive language, we want to help with you, and in fact, make sure that you mention the existence of mental health supports.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. That's a really great example and kind of helping us understand the nuance of all of this, I think is really, really important. So Anna and Ashley, I have a question for you all. Talking about examples and nuance, are there examples of schools, districts, and states that have successfully employed policies or strategies to reduce absenteeism and increase student engagement? If so, are they replicable?
I'll go ahead and start. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about a couple of the buckets of policies that we're seeing, just to kind of go back to what I was saying about one size might not fit all, and there is not a silver bullet. I wanted to kind of give an example of the range. New Mexico, and I'm not going to go over all these bills, but as Michelle said, you'll get a copy of the slides, and they are hyperlinked. But New Mexico enacted the Attendance for Success Act, and this really changed their state's focus from students habitually truant to those frequently absent for any reason. So the law shifted the district responses from to absences from punitive to a more supportive kind of whole school prevention approach. And then there you see, like I said, Anna's going to talk a little bit more about collaboration and community partners. Vermont is one example of a state that's taken that approach. Another strategy can be through data collection and reporting, as well as adding that kind of human story. Hetty mentioned the relationship building. So these attendance review teams can get together to discuss students and strategies that will be effective. And then if you could go to the next slide. So states have also looked to teachers, and Illinois requires teacher professional development to include training on supportive services, as well as how to promote attendance and engagement. Again, going back to that, making sure that classroom is an engaging learning experience for students. And then some states like, I think we're a slide behind if you, oh. if you want to, yeah, there we go. So some other states have looked at how can we support schools financially. Colorado is an example. They've provided grant funding for attendance support services that schools and districts can apply for. So that could include like mental health services for students, social workers in the schools, those kinds of things. And then the next slide, I mentioned, truancy and, the tendency to kind of just look at the punitive approaches, but there's a lot of things that can be done around prevention. And Rhode Island comes to mind. They've done a lot of work around data collection and reporting, and they have a tracker that can spot the number of students in each school who were on track to miss more than 10% of the school year. So going back to what Hetty said, catching it before it gets to be the 18 plus days over the school year. And again, early intervention programs is another kind of policy lever. And I will turn it over. I know LPI and Anna have been keeping an eye on a couple of strategies.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. Can we go to the next slide? So I wanted to share some on-the-ground examples from some research that we've been doing in California. And we have been conducting some case study research on community schools in California that are funded through our state grant program. And what we noticed is that there were schools in each of the places we were studying that had really reduced their chronic absenteeism rates. And so we were really curious, and we said, like, okay, what are we seeing in terms of the patterns of what's happening at these schools? And so what you see here is a report, and then we also have a 2-page fact sheet that's intended more as a resource for policymakers. And the link is hyperlinked in the slides, and also thanks, Michelle, for popping that in the chat. So that's the information I'm going to be drawing from today. Next slide. So we profiled 4 sites in the course of our case study research. And I think what's been really interesting is that we tried to really capture a lot of the variation in geography and, urbanicity in our state. So we had 2 sites that were in Southern California. The picture you see on the bottom is Lucille Roybal Allard Elementary School. It's in Huntington Park. It's part of Los Angeles Unified, which is the 2nd biggest school district in the country, grades K through 6. And then the picture you see on the top is Elk Hills Elementary, and that's in Kern County, which is in the Central Valley in California. It's very agricultural, very rural. It's part of a rural full-service community schools consortium serving grades K-8. And then the other 2 schools that we studied, one of them was in San Francisco, and one of them in Linwood Unified, which is in Los Angeles County. It's a smaller and more suburban district in Los Angeles County. So I think what was really striking to me is that we just saw an incredible consistency with how these community schools were addressing chronic absenteeism, and also a lot of consistency with, all of the information that you've already heard. And so I think this really demonstrates that in many ways we know what to do. It's just hard work and it takes time and resources. So I'll share a little more about what we saw happening in these schools. Next slide, please. So this is a graph of what we were seeing around the chronic absenteeism rates in the sites that we were studying. I thought it was interesting. You can see that there was some peaking happening in the 2021-22 school year, also 2022-23. And so I think, again, it's really helpful to be looking at data locally when you're thinking about chronic absenteeism, because the pattern may look a little different depending on the context. The schools, some of these community schools, you see some of them were peaking at 40-50% at the height of the pandemic. And these are schools that are serving, in California, our grant program prioritizes funding for the highest need communities and schools in our state. So these are schools that were heavily impacted by the pandemic. And what you can see is that they have really started to drop their chronic absenteeism rates down, in some cases close to pre-pandemic levels. And, but it's a moving target. I definitely agree that this is not a silver bullet. For example, even Lucille Roybal Allard, they had reported their data to us mid-year last year, because we still, Ketty, you were pointing out the need for like data to be released in a timely manner. We haven't gotten our state attendance results yet in California. And I bet that's true in other states as well. Our dashboard has not been updated from the 2023-24 school year. So this whole report was based on self-reported data from the schools, and those numbers jump around. So the Lucille Roybal Allard team was telling us, hey, like our numbers were down at 20%, but they're actually back up a little higher by the end of the year. And so I think it just reminds us that this is ongoing work, right? And this is a snapshot in time, but the work needs to continue. And it's so important to have access to that local data because we cannot rely on state data systems. Although I'm encouraged to see in the chat, Hetty, that you're saying that there's states that are shifting in a more timely way. Are there any states that you would highlight? I was just curious, like if there are particular states that are releasing data in a more timely way.
Well, so I think there's two ways of thinking about the release of data. One is, are states doing it on a really ongoing way? And there's also a difference between public and just to the school itself, so, or to the educators. But public release, Connecticut is one of the best. They release data they collect and release data every month. So you get a real sense throughout the year what's going on. And actually Rhode Island, but Rhode Island, I will say, is a little smaller, like compared to California, tiny. They actually release data, I think it's weekly, or almost daily. Like they're constantly updating their stuff, but they're a small system. But what I'm seeing is that, so right now, last year, I think we had maybe 10 states that had released their data by October. And that was a huge increase from the prior year, which was very few states. I can't remember the number. This year, I think we've got about 16 states that released data for 23-24 by the end of October. So that's where we're also seeing shift. The annual report is getting released. And sometimes what I think happens, and this can be a role for advocates, I think what happens is people like, I'm not going to release the data till I have all my data on academics, on whatever other things we collect. And then it gets caught up in this whole production of a whole thing where you can say, no, you can just release the chronic absence data. You can release all the other stuff later, but we need to take action on that now, and making it public versus there are places that have, some states have real-time data systems. Not all of them, but a handful of them, but they don't always make, like Kentucky has that, but they don't actually release the data to the public until it's the end of the year, even though educators can get on and see it. And there are some reasons for doing that. They want to double check, they want to, so there's a worthwhile conversation about what gets released, but at least the end of the year data from the previous school year, that should be like available pretty soon at the beginning of the next year, because otherwise who's going to do anything with it?
Right. Right. Thank you. I don't mean to lead us down a detour, but I think this really came up in our research as we're looking at places that are, effectively addressing chronic absenteeism, and they're going to a great deal of effort to be tracking their own data because they don't always have access to, steady and timely data sources. So
and then Anna, I'll just say one other plug. Oakland Unified actually releases its data, I think, like monthly. So you don't, a district could also make its own decision to release data.
Yes. And we also have done some research on community schools in New Mexico. And Albuquerque has a really wonderful data dashboard that's very transparent and public, and it's at the site level. So I agree, some districts that have the resources are really able to support this work through transparency. So let me get back to what I was supposed to be talking about. Next slide, please. I'll move quickly through it because I want to make sure we have time for discussion. But what did we see? What were these community schools actually doing to impact chronic absenteeism? First, please excuse the animations next, please. They were definitely working on family engagement. They were, again, that relationship building piece. They were texting, they were making phone calls, they were doing social media campaigns, they were conducting home visits. And the point around unexcused versus excused absences, we saw community school coordinators that were calling students who were absent, who weren't at school in the morning, to find out, hey, what's going on? Like, should this be an excused absence? Making sure that the paperwork gets filled out so that things are tracked appropriately. They really did focus on relationship building opportunities. All of the practitioners in our study talked about how important it was for students to feel connected to school, to create a warm and welcoming environment so that they want to be there. So they established things like advisory classes and mentorship programs. They were surveying students to find out what activities they would like, what kind of after school enrichment they wanted. They were offering activity, just fun, trying to make school fun and a place where it's fun to be. They also were consistently, as I know we've really talked about data a lot, but they were just being really thoughtful in the way that they were tracking and using data. And they were really using that to guide the way they were approaching supports. So we talked about multi-tier systems of supports. So making sure that there are universal attendance strategies in place, like, incentives for all students. And then also making sure that there's really targeted reports, like, referral to services, whether it's an issue with transportation, maybe some counseling is needed, whatever the issue may be, to targeting supports to students who are missing the most school. And then, as we know, community schools are partnering with a lot of community-based organizations and local government, and that's how they're really set up to be able to provide those targeted supports to students and families. And as I said, mental health, transportation, sometimes even housing supports. The school that we studied in San Francisco, they, as a community, Buena Vista Horace Mann, actually partnered with the city to turn their gymnasium into a shelter for families experiencing homelessness on a nightly basis. And there's a local nonprofit that actually runs it. But you can really think out of the box with the community school strategy to identify, like, what is the most pressing issues in our community and what do we want to do about it. And then finally, I mentioned the community school coordinator, that it's just so powerful to have someone, in a position at a school who can really support that relationship building, that outreach. They're not necessarily taking the place of someone like an attendance clerk, but they're really supporting around the engagement and outreach. In West Kern County, there was one of the sites had a van. The coordinators would, if a student missed the bus in a rural area, that can be a real issue, right? If you miss your ride or you miss the bus, how are you going to get to school? They actually were taking a 12-passenger van and driving to pick students up. So, there's just a lot of ways that we can think about trying to establish those relationships. So I'm gonna, oh yeah, I think I have one more slide. Be really fast. Next slide, please. So just again, underscoring the point that this really is about being proactive, preventive, restorative. Like, none of these schools were making assumptions or trying to punish the students and families. They really were working on building those trusting relationships. And then also these schools were all part of a broader network of community schools. It's very difficult for a school to effectively establish community partnerships if they're going at it alone. And so being part of a broader network can be very helpful. And that's it. Pause there.
Thank you. Hetty, my last question for the panel is for you. And, we discussed in the preparation for this call that, one of the goals that we have for this is to really empower the people who are attending this webinar to feel like they have the knowledge and recommendations to go back to their schools, districts, state boards of education, et cetera, to really help to start to address these issues. So my question for you is, are there policies or programs that you would recommend to schools and districts for improving attendance? What should the role of parents, families, communities, and even the youth, the students impacted by this issue? What recommendations do you have for them?
Yeah, well, I'm going to use a couple of visuals that, in some ways, as Anna said, the good news about this is it's not like we don't know what to do. The issue is that we don't always do it, and we don't always use our data to figure out when it's not happening. So my first, by the way, this isn't on the slide, but I would first advocate, go find out what your data is. If you don't have data you don't know what it is, one, it might be on, and you look at most state websites now have chronic absence data. It might be outdated. If it's outdated, then you should be talking to them about getting more up-to-date data. That's a voice. And you can also ask your school district and find out, even if it's not on a state website, if you're working locally, what is your chronic absence levels? The second thing I think you want to know is, what do they have in place to support making sure the kids are showing up to school? And really what you want to do is make sure you have a tiered support system that starts with prevention. So it's a support system where you're looking at whether you have those positive conditions for learning, and then you're in a these are all things, by the way, on our website if you want to know what to look for. I would that then you add in stuff more related to attendance. The foundational supports, those positive conditions of learning that I talked before, they require everyone in the school. They require the principal. They require everyone supporting it, because that's the only way you can put in place. And then you can do things like, when absences happened, what's the interaction like? Is it, I missed you, Anna, and I hope you'll be here? Or, Anna, where were you? And I'm going to threaten you with court. You know, and that also helps you think about where your advocacy would be. You really want this positive prevention oriented. And then tier 2 and tier 3. And if absences are high, often it could mean that you're missing prevent that, you know, parts of this. Often it's the tier 1 and foundational supports, as Anna was saying, that sometimes isn't in place. That's what the high levels are a sign of. And so you could be advocating for that. But then if you go to the next slide, I would just say the other thing that we see this is you need to have really a systemic approach. So you need actionable data that activates positive engagement, that engages strategic partnerships, that you're using the data to figure out who needs more support. It's not equal every place. Low income, high poverty communities face greater barriers to attendance, face different challenges, and they need more support to making sure that kids are there. This is about making sure it's shared responsibility and that you're building capacity to put all of this in place. And what I would also say, so you as advocates and community members can both make sure you have the data, make sure that the systems are in place, but also you can help educate folks about what are the big barriers to attendance that are making it hard for kids to show up in place, so that people then put in place a tiered approach and strategic partnerships that really address those barriers. For example, thinking about this is in Baltimore City. This is a pre-pandemic one. I think it was middle and high school kids were having huge problems with getting to school. And it's because they relied on the city bus system, and the city bus system didn't have enough buses for when the kids were going to school. Kids were literally at the bus stop, and the bus was full and would pass them and keep on going. Now, that's a systems problem. So then they created this thing where they would all have an app that they could complain about the buses and who was passing them up. So you could inform city, transportation. Look, you got buses that are passing us up. This is not us not trying to get to school. It's you are not providing us the resources. So if we know what the issue is and we can create advocacy around it to alert the systems, sometimes in schools, sometimes in communities that need to change to address those barriers, that's another key role, because no one knows what the barriers and the maybe meaningful solutions might be in the same way that kids and families who are affected by the challenges will know it themselves.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for reminding us that a lot of this is interconnected. We know that our network at IEL, as we ask our field, where are the issues impacting your community the most and your schools the most? The top 3 issues is housing insecurity, food insecurity, and transportation insecurity. And so as both you and Anna mentioned in your presentations, and as Kelly referenced in the chat, like those 3 things really do impact a student's ability to get to school and to stay in school. So really thank you for highlighting those.
Well, and Anna, I realize it's connected, but like the housing thumb, if I'm remembering, the school in San Francisco actually, because it heard about housing as a challenge, ended up converting part of its school to actually be a shelter for families to deal with the homelessness, because housing in San Francisco, which is where I live, is just insanely difficult and expensive.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, it's a singular example. I can't point to like very many community schools that have taken on shelter services, but it's a pretty amazing example because it was absolutely came out of this community that was experiencing pressure from gentrification and had a lot of housing insecurity.
So thank you so much to our panel. That was a really robust and really quality conversation that you all just had with us. With that, we have 5 minutes. I would love to open it up to our guests. So does anyone have a question? Feel free to take yourself off mute. And if not, I can start the conversation off with a question.
I could ask a question.
Yeah, please do.
Hi, Kelly Sperduto. So we have found that our community school site coordinators can do a really great job with tier 1 interventions for attendance, but there's some educational policies that get in the way of funding those things, i.e. not providing kids snacks during the day or gifts of public funds. So I'm just wondering creative ways to fund those tier 1 interventions that end up having a cost to them at times.
I think one thing that we've seen some of the community schools out here doing is working with their community partners that may have more flexibility around certain funding streams, because that's come up in California too, is, you know, some limitations on the use of the state funding. But we sometimes see that, for example, a community-based organization might be able to provide the food in a more flexible way. So I don't know, how do you, or Ashley, if you have additional thoughts, but that's what we're seeing is just some creativity around the way partners are collaborating.
Well, I would say two different things. One is like one tier 1 kind of intervention can be incentives, but we sometimes don't think creatively enough about them, of things that don't cost. First in line to the lunch line, not having to wear your uniform on Friday. There's a lot of things that are incentives that aren't actually, and relationship-based incentives, like you get to be with your best friend, you get to do whatever, actually go a long way with kids. So I think sometimes, like I know there's one that people do tier 1, which is take your, it's like, what is it? Get your selfie to school. And so then all the times the kids show up, they take selfies of everyone, I mean, and you have it on your phone. So one is I would want you to be really creative. The biggest thing I think is we have to get more creative about how do we make engaging relationship building and talking about attendance a key part of what teachers do in a way that doesn't overwhelm them given everything we want teachers to do. Teachers are key to this, and there's recent Ad Council research that really talked about how teachers are the most trusted. And I think we have to do more of thinking with our community partners and everyone else about how we support teachers, because they're also the ones that kids see the most often and are really the most trusted voice.
Thank you. Any other
trips? I love that.
My husband and I were having a conversation this weekend about reading, and he said, Book It really did work. Like, I'll read 50 books, it means I get a free pizza. So that's not necessarily free, but it does work. Maybe there's some creative solutions we can establish to address this issue with students. We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Anyone else out there? Yeah, Tiffany, please.
Sorry, I've been in and out because I'm at school with all these high schoolers. I just have a quick question. Well, quick question, because at the charter school that we sit at, and in my position as a family engagement program manager, I've been noticing that we've been having a lot of issues with our African American students. Not when they attend school, they're not in the class, and when they in school, they're wandering the halls. And if they are, wandering the halls, they're coming late to class. And so something at the charter school, we've been trying to figure out how can we engage them to want to be in the classes. And the school already does, a lot of professional development pieces on, how to put your bias to the side and stuff like that and relate to the students. But I don't know if it's actually working.
I have a question, Tiffany. Have you ever had a chance to talk to the kids and find out?
I have, so some of them, not all of them. And some just say they don't like their teacher, or their teacher is just not understanding what they're going through or what they're, trying to say, or they might get picked on in class because, they might not agree with what the teacher is saying. Or they just want to be in the hallways because all their friends are in the hallways and they want to have a good time. But it's that transition piece from middle school to high school, where they feel like they're still in the middle school environment, and it's totally different when you get to high school. I don't know, I'm just at a loss for words. And also, their African American students have the highest absent rates in the school, and it's only 61 of them at a school for like out of 400 students.
So my immediate sense is you have a challenge of belonging and connection and support for your African American. I mean, you've just said for 3 minutes, so this is a totally cursory thing.
No,
So
you summed it up really well.
and my question is, how can you work with some of those kids to unpack that and figure out what are solutions to creating that belonging and sense of connection? Like I do know sometimes and I think it's partly about sometimes you even can do fish bowls where the kids are empowered to talk about what they're feeling and experiencing, and the teachers have to sit and listen. What are they saying about is or isn't happening in my classroom? And they can't you gotta sort of, how do you do this where they don't immediately go on the defensive, but actually have to hear and grasp what the kids are saying, and then jointly together come up with how do we make classrooms places where our kids want to be, all of our kids. And my bet is if you came up with something that worked for them, it's going to also work for some of the other kids who are probably all sitting in the classroom out in the hallways too. It's just they're kind of like the canary in the coal mine, most affected. But something's not happening around connection and engagement.
Okay.
I also
I'll
like
bring it
to
up.
offer, I know that we're pushing time, but we've seen some of the community schools that we've researched have established mentorship programs that have been really impactful. And those involve the whole staff. So it's involving teachers, but like everybody on campus is participating. And they each get like a cohort of students, and then they have a day, like a month of every month, where the community school coordinator has been planning activities. And then that cohort meets with their mentor just for fun, for relationship building. And I don't know if that's a useful idea or not, but just creating those spaces for, like it doesn't, especially if the teacher is maybe a point of friction, that to try to give that space for like other adults to establish supportive relationships can sometimes be helpful.
Anna, I just would add to the mentoring. There's lots of mentoring. It's a fantastic example. There's something called success mentoring, but there's also peer mentoring that can be done. And there's a group called Peer Group Connections, and they have high school juniors and seniors mentoring the freshmen when they're coming in with really it's every 2 weeks. They have a whole curriculum. You actually got to get the teachers involved because then they equip the kids. And the impacts were improved attendance and achievement, particularly for African American and Latino kids. And this was and they have high school and middle school models, but it's a little bit moving the peers. But I think you might have to think about both peer issues and adult issues, because I don't want the peers to have to make up for what the adults aren't doing, if that makes sense.
So with that, we are at time. Thank you so much to our panel. That was a really, really robust conversation. I learned a lot in that discussion, so I know our attendees did as well. So again, please join me in thanking our panelists. By the end of this week, you'll receive the deck, you'll receive the recording and any references that were alluded to in the presentation with those hyperlinks. So we look forward to seeing you in December with our next quarterly webinar. We're going to be talking about what does the education policy look in the country post-election. So that's going to be an interesting one. So please fill out our feedback. Takes 1 minute or less. We really do use that to help inform how we deliver this content to you all. So thank you so much. We truly appreciate your time today, and have a good one. Thank you all.